Welcome to the Paperless Productivity Podcast, where we have experts give you the insights, know-how, and resources to help you transform your workplace from paper to digital, while making your work life better at the same time.
Thanks for joining me. My name is Paul Gorman, and I'm your host for today's podcast. Recently, ImageSoft hosted our annual customer conference, Velocity 2021. We discussed the industry's hottest topics plaguing organizations since the start of the pandemic. These included digital evidence management, online dispute resolution, and electronic signatures. For today's podcast, we wanted to share an edited portion of the online dispute resolution session. We did that session with attorney Susan Guthrie. Susan is a nationally recognized family law and mediation attorney. Susan sat down with us to discuss her firsthand experience with online dispute resolution and how it has changed her business forever. Let's listen in as Vince Hansen introduces Susan Guthrie, leader in the online mediation space and ODR specialist.
I'd like to welcome Susan Guthrie. It's my pleasure to introduce her. For those of you that don't know Susan, she's nationally recognized as one of the top family law and mediation attorneys in the country. With multiple decades of experience, she's become a leader in the online mediation space, having trained close to 20,000 attorneys on how to practice online. She sits on the executive council of the ABA section for dispute resolution. She also sits on the board of directors of the Southern California Mediation Association. Susan's extremely passionate about expanding access to mediation and finding alternatives to a more traditional adversarial litigation approach. She's also the creator and host of the iTunes podcast called the Divorce and Beyond podcast with Susan Guthrie, and also the acclaimed Learn to Mediate online podcast for dispute resolution professionals. Thank you and welcome, Susan. It's a real pleasure to have you participate in today's session.
Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it.
So Susan, I thought I'd start with just a little bit about your background as an attorney and how you kind of ended up focusing your practice on arbitration and mediation.
Yeah, I think like many of my colleagues, I am a reformed litigator. I got out of law school, actually worked on Wall Street for a short period of time, but then joined the firm and became a very traditional litigator in all senses, spent most of my time in a courtroom or getting ready to go into a courtroom. And in my particular area of practice as a family law attorney, it didn't take long for me to notice that although litigation is an effective way to separate up families and end marriages, it's not a particularly positive pathway for families to restructure. So I started exploring alternate routes. Mediation really was the most appealing to me, again, because I think it does have some of the best results for clients. So I transitioned from litigator to a more mediative practice around about 12 years ago. And I haven't set foot in a courtroom in 6 years, and I'm happy to say that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So when did you start to see this big need for mediations to start to move online? Was it a particular client you were working with or a conference you went to? Like where did this big idea kind of come from?
Yeah, for me, it was purely a personal situation. Most people, I think, to that question these days would be saying, as soon as the pandemic hit, I knew I had to go online. But for me, it was about 6 years ago when I had practiced for over 25 years on the East Coast. I was in Connecticut and New York, and I suddenly moved to California. And I wasn't licensed. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know California's family law. And so I quickly figured out that it doesn't matter if you hang a shingle there, you still needed to be able to work with clients where you actually knew what you were doing and people knew who you were. So it was actually 6 years ago that I said, well, there must be a way to do this. I've heard about this video conferencing thing. Let me give it a shot. And one thing that I quickly learned was, one, there's a lot more that you need to know about it than just flipping on a camera. But flip of that, I did find out that not only did I love working online, my clients loved the ease and practicality and reduce costs, et cetera, of the benefit. So I've been online ever since. And that's a great deal of why I've not set foot in a courtroom for the same 6 years.
So I'm curious, right? You have this group of peers, friendships, working colleagues. Like, what was the reaction with those peers in the legal community? Were they like very apprehensive of just the idea and concept of doing something maybe very different and new that hadn't been done before, right?
As far as they knew hadn't been done, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. Once I settled into that online practice, I had some colleagues who were like, hey, that's kind of interesting. Can you show me how you're doing that? So I did create sort of an online program teaching people how to work online. But most people's responses to that were, oh, that's a cute idea, or that's a nice idea. But most people had no real interest in learning how to practice online. I maybe trained 50 or 60 colleagues prior to the pandemic hitting. And then honestly, what happened with the onset of the pandemic is, it was utter fear and panic. It was actually quite a devastating moment for colleagues who realized very quickly that their livelihood and their entire way of practice was no longer feasible. And I can say my inbox got quite a heavy usage for a while there. And I was lucky because at that time I was in leadership, as you mentioned, with the ABA DR section. And so I was able to start doing training webinars for like 500 professionals at a time to help them transition. But they always say, and it's actually a part of the original presentation I did, that the most expensive words in any profession are, but that's the way we've always done it. And if we ever needed a reminder of the truth of that lesson, COVID was it, and the pandemic was it. And although there was a great deal of fear, I would say the vast majority of my colleagues now can't remember when they weren't online and can't remember why they didn't like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a friend who also practices law in estate planning. And I don't know if it's still the correct statistic, but it was last year. And there's like 4 states in the entire country that allow estate planning documents to be signed and witnessed remotely. And she was telling me the process of going to continuing education classes. This legislation was just getting ready to get passed. And she was in the room like, wow, this is going to be an incredible opportunity to really work in a very different way. But there were all of these people in the room that they were not quite on board with the change part, right? And it was like, this has to be done face to face. This is the way it's always been done. And then, as you said, right, the pandemic happened, and it's like everybody was like, well, maybe there is something to that continuing education class that we had, and maybe we should do this. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, everybody really wanted to jump on the train once they had to. It just took a little while.
Yeah. So clearly there are some big differences and also some similarities between mediation in person and doing it online. But I'd love to hear maybe from your perspective of, working with individuals day in and day out and doing these trainings, like what are some of those key advantages of ODR from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them are pretty obvious. The ease of scheduling, the ability to get decision makers in the room. Those are a few of the ones that colleagues cite most often as their favorite benefits. Not having to sit in traffic. I think everyone loves that one, especially if you're like me and live in a city like Chicago. I never have to get in a car. But there are other benefits that I don't know that people were as aware of in the beginning, but that become apparent as you are practicing online. And part of it is just, it's dispute resolution, right? Online dispute resolution. Well, people in dispute are generally at a high state of emotion. And we have found, and it's actually neurobiological, that people are better able to manage their emotional content in this sort of a setting, as opposed to when they're sitting in a room together across a conference room table, or even when they're in the same building but in separate conference rooms. There's just, your brain does not emit the same high level of adrenaline and cortisol, et cetera, which means that people are much more able to tolerate the conversations, think clearly, and make good decisions and agreements when they're in a mediated setting. And then the other aspects that I don't think anyone really realized, but it's interesting, I was just talking to a judge that I know, and he was talking about this same factor. It's actually easier in many ways to read emotions and read and connect with people through a video thumbnail because of the focus on the face, because everybody is looking at the same picture of each person and is able to see the minute play of emotions running across someone's facial expression. And we know that our facial expression has a great deal to do with our communication. So the judge I was just speaking to actually said, when he's on the bench and a witness is sitting next to him, looking out at a courtroom, all he's seeing is the side of that person's face. But when that person is testifying on screen, he's looking right at their face, and said he can really get a better feel for the veracity of that witness and for the emotional content of what's going on. So there have been a great deal of study and learning that we've gone through as we've so quickly transitioned online. And in many ways, I think that there are areas that are superior online. People thought that whole rapport and emotional control would be more difficult separate. And in fact, it's turned out to be something that's even easier or is manageable online.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I mean, what you're describing, think about if you're talking to somebody over the phone, like if we were having this conversation over the phone versus being able to see each other like we are right now, it's a completely different conversation when you can get that facial expression and the emotion that comes through with the words, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And you really start to be able to feel that you are establishing relationships with people when you can see them. A number of my mediators that I've trained mentioned that prior to having an online practice, they would do their pre-mediation meetings, as you just said, by telephone. And now most of them are doing them by video. For a number of reasons, that's a better way to do it. But what it also does is allow them to start making relationships and building the trust and rapport with the clients, with the attorneys, with the participants. And they believe, most of them anecdotally say, that has actually helped them move cases along faster when they get to the actual mediation or arbitration.
So Susan, I'm curious, obviously we're talking about technology, which not everyone is in IT. And as someone here at ImageSoft, I do a lot of video conferencing with clients, presentations, demonstrations with clients and prospects all over the country. Sometimes stuff goes wrong, right? Like we were doing a presentation a few months ago with maybe 200 people. And the person that was hosting the call, a storm came through, knocked his power out, and it was like the meeting had almost quasi-ended, right? And so I'm just wondering, right, like, have you had a situation where things have gone really sideways and wrong? Is there a situation you may have been into, or at least are willing to share? Are there some best practices about, hey, my Wi-Fi went out, my laptop battery went dead? I mean, there's just so many scenarios that can possibly happen, or that you have actually been a part of or seen happen. I'm just curious.
So yes, unfortunately, if you're going to practice online, you have to know that sooner or later, the tech is going to fail you. It's not, I always tell people when I'm presenting or when I'm doing trainings, it's not if it's going to fail, it's when. So you need to be prepared. And as a best practice, that's one thing that I tell everyone. You need to just let everybody know that, hey, this is technology. Something might happen. I might disappear from the screen, which has happened. I've had everything go wrong. I've had my computer decide it was time to update itself right in the middle of a mediation. I was in a hearing, and I had the Wi-Fi go out in my neighborhood, as we were talking about earlier. I mean, you name it, I, as the practitioner, have had the issues happen, but I've had everything happen to participants as well. So one of the things I always tell people, and it's actually in my pre-mediation materials that I give to people, is acknowledge that it's likely to happen and have a safety or a tech failure protocol ready to go and in place that people know about. And I say, keep it simple. I adhere to that KISS method, right? Keep it simple, super simple is what I switched it to. I said, keep it simple, stupid. Someone took offense to that. So keep it super simple. And I would just tell people, if this happens, try to log back on. If you can't get back on, send me a text message. And I always made sure that everybody has my text, my cell phone number, and I make sure I have all of the attorneys and participants' cell phone numbers. And the number one tip I always give to practitioners online is stay calm yourself, because it's just like when your 2-year-old falls down. And if you go rushing up with the, oh my God, are you okay? The waterworks are going to start, right? They're going to panic and they're going to cry, and it's going to be horrible. If you just stay calm when technology goes wrong, it can get worked out. I've had people log on from their phones. I've had people log on, call in by telephone. May not be ideal, but you can figure out what to do.
Well, I didn't tell you, but other people on this call have a copy of the presentation as well as the questions in case something happens to me. So we did have a plan B just in case for today.
Plan Bs are always a good idea. And another thing that struck me when you said that is a number of my mediators have told me that they, in their opening statement, will say to the participants, hey, this is, a new world for us all in this virtual medium. So let's all try to be a little kind to each other and understanding. And they actually thought that set a really nice tone and was helpful for the entire process, not just for the fact that it was virtual.
Yeah, definitely a great best practice. So the area you focus on is family law. Well, what's been the impact of ODR for parties going through a divorce, from what you've experienced, having maybe been on both sides of the house for a very long time? Like, what does that look like?
I really think it's been a game changer for family law in particular. Family law is incredibly well suited for mediation. It's actually a much better way for a family to restructure than litigation, which is about fault and blame and et cetera. But so what happened during the pandemic with all the courts closed is families were still needing assistance in helping restructure, but they had no other recourse with the courts closed but to find dispute resolution, to find mediation or collaborative attorneys, which in and of itself was a boon, because people who might not have sought out a mediator or a collaborative approach tried it or found out about it. And as they have been having positive experiences moving through it, more people are moving that way. And then this ability to be able to work through your family law matters in this sort of a setting by keeping as I mentioned earlier, you can, somewhat reduce that emotional content. It's hard to think of a legal situation that's more emotional than a couple going through talking about their money and their children, but they're able to stay in the same virtual room together rather than having to be in separate rooms much more often and learn how to communicate with each other because they have that little bit of distance here. It's also been incredibly beneficial because we can handle high conflict and domestic violence cases where I would never do them where these parties are in the same room or even in the same building. I can be effective in an online capacity. So it's really been a game changer for us in the family law field.
That's great. So the training programs that you have been very much a leader in over the last few years, I'm curious what types of law the attorneys are focused on. Are there specific types of law that they want to potentially use our ODR and mediation for? Are there any that maybe stand out to you as you've been having discussions with peers around the country?
Yeah, I would say the first one that comes to mind is anything with insurance involved in the litigation. So personal injury, construction failure, all of that, because one, the insurance companies love it and they drive that entire, tort work area. And they love it because it's much less expensive for them to pull together their adjustments. They don't have to send their adjusters. They don't have to send their people. Depositions can be done in this manner. And it's much easier from the side of things with the practitioners and the attorneys and all to get the real decision makers on the screen. So what often would happen in a mediation that was happening in Minneapolis with an insurance company from Hartford, they would send a junior adjuster out for the mediation to do the travel, but who would have a limited authority. They could only offer up to $100,000 and it's a case that's worth more. So then throughout the mediation, they would have to call the person who could actually make that decision. And now one of the top benefits in that particular industry that I think people see is that it's so easy to pull everyone together, get these mediations scheduled in an expeditious manner, and have the actual decision makers at the table. Because a lot of times those can be, if you have a construction failure case or something of that, you could have the person who built the building, the architect, and numerous different parties. You may have 5 different plaintiffs who were injured. It can be a huge number. You could have them all here on this screen as opposed to an in-person setting. So those are the, definitely one of the areas where I've seen a huge uptick that anyone I know who practices in those areas has pretty much said they are going to, at the very least, maintain an online practice, if not just stay 100% online.
Susan, what are the tools of the trade that you've figured out over the last 5 years, like the technology, how your office needs to be set up, the type of equipment you need to have? Just like what are some of those maybe tricks of the trade or best practices that you really need to have at your disposal if you're going to have the right presence online? And I know we've got members of the justice community on with us, including folks in the court that have likely not done it this way before. So I think they love to kind of hear your perspective on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And, that was something that was a little hit or miss for me in the very beginning 5 years ago. Now, many practitioners who have gone through the pandemic have realized having the actual hardware of having an external camera, having, I have this big old, I'm not using it right now, but I have a big old fancy microphone. Those are 2 things, as we were talking about earlier, how important people's facial expressions actually are and their body language. You might have noticed I'm a bit of a hand talker, and so my hands are constantly going, and I've learned to do that. But so you need to have a good and clear picture so that people can see you and your lighting and all of that. So everybody I know now has a ring light in their life. I think everybody has hit Amazon. Having good audio is just as important. It's really important that people be able to hear you, because the other major portion of our communication is in the inflection in our tone, not necessarily what we're saying, it's how we say it. So those are 2 of the key factors for people. I do think as we're going forward, the technology, now that we're going to move into this new world of in-person and online, that the needs for technology are going to continue to evolve, because I really think the trend for the future will be hybrid dispute resolution and hybrid meetings, et cetera. So having, an omnidirectional camera, having an omnidirectional microphone and speakers, all of that's going to become more and more important. The other thing, and you mentioned it earlier, Vince, when we were getting ready here, having more than one screen to work off of is critically important when you are practicing online, unless you want to be making the screen itty bitty so that you can see the documents, or that you can take a look, or you can write on something. So I'm actually, when I do a mediation, I'm usually working off of 3 separate screens, one for notes, one for the documents of the case, and one for the actual visuals of the matter.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things. Once you go to multiple monitors, and then maybe you're traveling and you're in a hotel, you're like, I'm so much more productive when I have my station with all of my stuff and I can open up multiple things. So yeah, I completely understand. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I am curious about just the overall question about security, right? Like, I think this year, more than any time I can ever remember, we hear so much about cybersecurity, malware, ransomware attacks, hacked information from private companies and government agencies. Is security something that is really a big topic amongst the justice community when it comes to this type of technology and moving things online?
Absolutely. It's been the biggest concern from day one since the world transitioned online, or at least the justice world and the dispute resolution world transitioned online. The number one question I got from the beginning to now is around how do you protect confidentiality? How do you protect privacy? How do you make sure your proceedings are confidential and secure? And then, of course, we had the whole Zoom bombing at the beginning of the pandemic where there was, the panic around Zoom bombing. But what that shows is actually what I'll call it being a naive or inexperienced practitioner, just thinking, well, heck, it is just flipping on, opening up my laptop and opening a Zoom meeting or an RDO meeting, and not realizing that there are a number of best practices that we also need to take into consideration. Number one being, don't disseminate your Zoom logon on LinkedIn and not expect that some crazy people are going to show up and share something on the screen. So it is an ever evolving area. I think our security is getting better and better, but I think it's the education as well for participants who need to understand just how critical their practices are as they use technology. And every time you add a new technology, you better know the background of keeping that technology safe.
Yeah, completely agree here. Susan, we are so appreciative of you joining today's session and just sharing your knowledge and experience working with the ADR and ODR community. Thanks again for spending time with us. It was really enjoyable to talk to you today and just hear a little bit more about everything that you've been doing online. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been an interesting year and a half. So thank you very much.
If you would like to learn more about online dispute resolution, our services, or our partnership with Resolve Disputes Online, please visit www.resolvedisputes.com. This concludes today's podcast. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks again for joining us on this podcast. To learn more about ImageSoft, please visit ImageSoftInc.com. That's ImageSoftInc.com. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to Paperless Productivity, where we tackle some of the biggest paper-based pain points facing organizations today. We'll see you next time.